Now this is one of the best, strongest, fastest leveling build for the Barbarian in Season 3. With this build you can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and bosses 10 levels higher than yourself. With this build I did focus on speed and damage to optimize the leveling experience. And I highly recommend you to watch this video from the very beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. Okay, so first I'm going to show you clearing this dungeon. And as you can see, the enemies are over 10 levels higher than myself. Now this build is so strong that it can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and bosses. But with this build, you do need to be around level 70 for this build to work. Because by the time you're at level 70, you'll be at World Tier 4 and start getting Ancestral level gear. And at World Tier 4, it'll be easier to get legendary aspects. So ideally, this is a leveling build from level 70 to 100. And I'll also go over some alternate gear if you don't have the exact gear I'm using. But I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections, and I'll have the full build layout in a default build planner in the description below. Okay, so next let's check out the skills. Now the basic skill I'm using is Lunging Strike, and this skill is really good because it'll dash you to the enemy and it'll generate you fury. And for the arsenal selection, make sure you change it to dual wield because your other skills will swap weapons, and when swapping weapons you'll gain benefits from your other skills and legendary aspects. The next skill I'm using is Hammer of the Ancients, and this is our main damage dealing skill. It'll destroy huge groups of enemies and bosses. And the arsenal selection for Hammer of the Ancients can only be your bludgeoning weapon. Now the next skill I'm using is Rallying Cry, and this skill will grant you unstoppable and generate you fury. And the next skill I'm using is War Cry, and this will grant you berserking and increase your damage. And the ultimate skill I'm using is Wrath of the Berserker, and this will grant you berserking, unstoppable, and greatly increase your damage. And the last skill I'm using is Charge, and this skill got a huge buff in Season 3. It's really good for movement and it'll do huge amounts of damage to groups of enemies. And for the arsenal selection for Charge, make sure you change it to slashing. Okay, so next for the weapon expertise. Now the best damage weapon expertise is the two-handed axe expertise. This weapon expertise will greatly increase your damage to vulnerable enemies and will also increase your critical strike chance against vulnerable enemies. Okay, so next for the Seneschal Construct, but I do want to mention that the construct isn't really needed for leveling, but it can make the leveling process easier and faster. So this is the setup for the construct I used from leveling from 70 to 100. So the first governing stone I'm using is Tempest, and this is just the fastest attack for the construct. And I paired it with the tuning stone Fortify support, which will grant you Fortify. And the next tuning stone I paired it with is Resource support, and this will help you gain some of your primary resource. And the last tuning stone I paired it with is Efficiency support, and this will increase your critical strike chance. And for the second governing stone I used Flash of Adrenaline, and this will greatly increase your damage. And the tuning stone I paired it with is Safeguard support, and this will increase your damage reduction. I also paired it with Tactical support, and this will decrease the cooldown of the supported skill. And the last tuning stone I paired it with is Duration support, and this will increase your skill's duration. So this is the setup I use for my construct when leveling. But like I mentioned before, the construct isn't really needed when leveling, because when leveling you might not even have all the governing stones or tuning stones. Okay, so next let's check out the skill tree. Now, I do want to mention that since this is a leveling build, I did focus more on speed and damage. So starting with the basic skills, I put 1 point into Lunging Strike and a point into Enhanced Lunging Strike. And this basic skill is really good because it'll dash you to an enemy and generate you some fury. Next for the core skills, I put 5 points into Hammer of the Ancients, a point into Enhanced Hammer of the Ancients, and a point into Furious Hammer of the Ancients. And this is our main damage dealing skill. This skill will destroy huge groups of enemies and can one-shot bosses. Next for the defensive skills, I put 1 point into Rallying Cry, a point into Enhanced Rallying Cry, and a point into Tactical Rallying Cry. And this skill will grant you Unstoppable and generate you fury. Next, I put 1 point into Outburst and 1 point into Tough as Nails. And these skills will apply bleeding damage to enemies when they hit you. And doing bleeding damage to the enemies will pair with some other skills and our gear. Now next for the brawling skills, I put a point into War Cry, a point into Enhanced War Cry, and a point into Power War Cry. And this skill will grant you berserking and greatly increase your damage. Next, I put 5 points into Charge, a point into Enhanced Charge, and a point into Power Charge. And Charge got a huge buff in Season 3. So this skill is really good for movement and it'll do huge damage to groups of enemies. Next, I put 3 points into Booming Voice, and this will greatly increase your shout skill's effect duration. And then I put 3 points into Swiftness, and this will greatly increase your movement speed. Next for the weapon mastery skills, I put 3 points into Pit Fighter and 3 points into Slaying Strike, and these skills will greatly increase your damage. Next, I put 3 points into Thick Skin and 3 points into Defensive Stance, and these skills are really good for defense and survivability. And next, I put 3 points into Counter Offensive, and this skill will greatly increase your damage when fortified. Next for the ultimate skills, I put a point into Wrath of the Berserker, a point into Prime Wrath of the Berserker, and a point into Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. And this ultimate skill will grant you berserking, unstoppable, and greatly increase your damage. Next, I put 3 points into Heavy Handed, 3 points into Wall Up, and 3 points into Brute Force. And these skills will greatly increase your damage when using a two-handed weapon. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into Unbridled Rage, and this will greatly increase your core skills damage, but in return it will cost more fury. But I do want to mention that if you're having issues generating your fury, you can switch out Unbridled Rage for unconstrained. But once you're around level 70 and get proper gear, you shouldn't have trouble generating fury. And if that's the case, it'll be better to use Unbridled Rage for the increased damage. Okay, so that's pretty much the full skill tree layout for this build. But like I mentioned before, I did focus more on speed and damage compared to defense and survivability. So with this setup, you should easily and quickly clear dungeons 10 levels higher than yourself. Okay, so next let's check out the gear. But I do want to mention that some of the gear and legendary aspects are needed for this build to work. And all the unique gears I'm using can be farmed by beating Dario. But if you don't have the unique gears I'm using, I'll share some alternate gear that you can use. And I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the helmet, I'm using the Tusk Helm of Jorts the Mighty. And for this helmet, you're looking for high damage while berserking and high maximum fury. And the unique aspect is when you gain berserking while already berserk, you have a 58% chance to become more enraged, granting 15% increased damage, 2 fury per second, and 10% cooldown reduction. Next, for the chest piece, the stats you're looking for is total armor and 3 damage reduction stats. And the legendary aspect is that you gain 1.1% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 66%. And I do want to mention that when enemies hit you, you will apply bleeding damage to them because of your other skills. So you can easily max out your disobedience stacks for this legendary aspect. Now you can switch this legendary aspect for the Juggernaut legendary aspect, which you will gain a lot of armor, but your evade's cooldown is doubled. But personally, I like to evade because when evading, you can dodge attacks, and depending on your boots, evading can greatly increase your movement speed. Next, for the gloves, you're looking for attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit, up to a chance to restore 17.3 primary resource, and ranks to Hammer of the Ancients. And the legendary aspect I have is that Hammer of the Ancients quakes outward, and its damage is increased by 15%. And this legendary aspect is important for your Hammer of the Ancients to do AoE damage. Next, for the pants, I'm using the Tybalt's Will unique pants. And for these pants, you're looking for high maximum resource and high damage reduction stats. And the legendary aspect is that you deal 40% increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. When you become unstoppable, gain 50 of your primary resource. So these pants are really good for increasing your damage. Next, for the boots, you're looking for movement speed, berserking duration, damage reduction while injured, and fury cost reduction. And the legendary aspect I have is that lucky hit. Damaging enemy with a core skill has up to a 40% chance to extend the duration of berserking by 2 seconds. Double this duration if it was a critical strike. Next, for the weapons. Now you're looking for these stats for all your weapons. So all stats, strength, overpowered damage, and damage while berserking. And for the two-handed mace, the legendary aspect I have is that each point of fury you generate while at maximum fury grants your next core skill within 5 seconds 4% increased damage up to 60%. And this legendary aspect will greatly increase your damage. Now for the one-handed weapons, ideally you're looking for a mace. The reason why is because its base stats has overpowered damage. And the stats you're looking for are all stats, strength, damage while berserking, and overpowered damage. But core skill damage is good as well. And the legendary aspect I have is that skills deal up to 20% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the maximum benefit while you have full primary resource. The second one-handed weapon I'm using is also a mace. And the legendary aspect I have is that charge calls for 4 ancients who also charge, dealing 30% of normal damage. So this legendary aspect is needed for your charge skills to destroy huge groups of enemies. And last but not least, for the two-handed slashing weapon, you're looking for an axe. The reason why is because the base stats has damage to healthy enemies. And the stats you're looking for is all stats, strength, overpowered damage, and damage while berserking. And the legendary aspect I have is that after swapping weapons 8 times, your next non-basic skill will overpower and deal 100% increased overpowered damage. And this legendary aspect will greatly increase your overpowered damage after swapping weapon 8 times. And because we have 3 skills that swap weapons, we should get this legendary aspect active frequently. Next, for the amulet, I'm using the Banished Lord's Talisman unique amulet. And you're looking for a high critical strike chance, overpowered damage, and resource generation. And the legendary aspect is that after you spend 300 of your primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower. Your critical strikes that overpower deal 120% increased damage, and this will greatly increase your overpowered damage. Next, for the rings. Now the first ring I'm using is the Ring of Red Fury, and you're looking for high maximum fury and high resource regeneration. And the unique aspect is that after spending 100 fury within 3 seconds, your next cast of Hammer of the Ancients, Upheaval, or Death Blow within 5 seconds is guaranteed to critical strike and deal 30% bonus critical strike damage. And this will greatly increase your critical strike damage to your Hammer of the Ancients. And for the second ring, the stats you're looking for is critical strike chance, damage while berserking, maximum fury, and resource regeneration. And the legendary aspect I have is that killing an enemy or hitting a boss with a core skill refunds 29% of your base fury cost. Can only happen once per skill cast. And this legendary aspect is important to regain your fury. But I do want to mention that if you can't find the Ring of Red Fury ring, you can use another ring similar to this ring I have equipped. And for the helmet, if you can't find the Tusk Helm of Jorts the Mighty, then you can find a helmet like this with damage while berserking, total armor, and maximum life. And for bosses, I recommend using the Godslayer crown because this will greatly increase your damage to bosses. And for the pants, if you can't find the Tybalt's Will pants, you do want to find pants like this. So for the pants, the stats you're looking for are total armor and 3 damage reduction stats. But if you're trying to clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons, then defense and survivability will be more important. So these pants will be better if you're pushing the higher tier nightmare dungeons. And last but not least, if you can't find the Banished Lore's unique amulet, you can use a legendary amulet like this. And the stats you're looking for is movement speed, total armor, damage reduction, and cooldown reduction. And I do want to mention that movement speed on your amulet is really important when fighting Uber Lilith. You need high movement speed on your boots and your amulet to easily dodge your fireballs. Okay, so that's pretty much the gear setup I have for this leveling build. But I'll have endgame builds and one-shot boss build videos as well, so check them out. Now really quickly for the gems. So for the armor pieces, the gems I'm using are ruby gems, and this will increase your maximum life. For the weapons, I'm using ruby gems to increase your overpowered damage. And for the jewelry, I'm using a diamond gem, an amethyst gem, and an emerald gem. And as you can see, using these 3 gems, I was able to cap out all my resistance. So the gems on your jewelry, you want to cap out your resistance. Okay, so next for the Paragon Board. Now the Paragon Board is fully optimized at endgame because I am at level 100. And with this Paragon Board, I did focus on damage, maxing out my resistance, and getting the important legendary nodes. Now I'm just going to quickly go over this Paragon Board, but I'll have the full Paragon Board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the starter board, I'm using the exploit glyph, and this will increase your vulnerable damage and apply vulnerable to enemies. The next Paragon Board I took is Carnage, and the glyph I'm using is Eerie, and this will greatly increase your berserking damage. And I also took the legendary node Carnage, which will greatly increase your attack speed when berserking. And with this Paragon Board, I did split it into 3 directions. So first heading left. And the next Paragon Board I took is Blood Rage, and I took the legendary node. And this legendary node states that killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to grant berserking for 5 seconds. Your damage is increased by 25% of your damage while berserking bonus. And as you can see, our current bonus is at 77% because we are stacking a lot of damage while berserking stats. Now going back to the Carnage Paragon Board and heading up this way. The next Paragon Board I took is Weapon Master, and I also took the legendary node. And this states that swapping weapons grants you 4% of your maximum fury. And since we have 3 skills that swap weapons, this will help generate you fury really quickly. And then heading back to the Carnage Paragon Board and then heading right. The next Paragon Board I took is Decimator, and the glyph I took is Crusher, and this will greatly increase your overpowered damage while wielding a mace. And I also took the legendary node Decimator, which states each time you make an enemy vulnerable, your damage is increased by 10% for 5 seconds. Overpowering a vulnerable enemy grants additional 10% bonus for 5 seconds. So this will greatly increase your damage to vulnerable enemies. And then heading down this way. And the next Paragon Board I took is Warbringer, and the glyph I'm using is Might, and this will greatly increase your damage while wielding 2-handed weapons. And I also took the legendary node Warbringer, and this states for every 75 fury you spend, gain 15% of your maximum life as Fortify. And this legendary node is really good for gaining Fortify. Okay, so this is pretty much a fully optimized Paragon Board at level 100. And with this Paragon Board, you can easily cap out your resistance. And really quickly for the glyphs, if you're trying to increase its radius, your glyph level has to be level 15 or higher. And make sure you check the requirements to get the additional bonus. And like I mentioned before, I'll have the full Paragon Board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below if you want to check that out. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, fastest leveling build for the Barbarian in Season 3. Now, this build is so strong that you should easily destroy enemies and bosses 10 levels higher than yourself to optimize your leveling experience. Now, with this build, I did focus on speed and damage to easily and quickly clear dungeons, but I'll have endgame builds for the Barbarian, so stay tuned. And if you want a strong and easy early leveling build for the Barbarian, then check out this video here. Hope this helps in more Diablo 4 videos to come. And of course,